The screen at the front of the war room did not flicker. It burned red. No warning. No buildup. Just my name, centered and boxed in a color every officer understands. I was standing against the back wall, hands folded behind me, boots planted shoulder-width apart, pretending I was just another body in the room. Captain Lauren Mitchell, Intelligence Branch, assigned to a joint training cell at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, in the year 2014. I was there to brief supporting data. I was not there to be discussed. But my name was the only one displayed. Personnel risk review. Immediate suspension pending inquiry. The words were clean. Clinical. Final. No one turned toward me right away. They stared at the screen as if it might correct itself. My clearance level. My Afghanistan deployment. Letters of recommendation from 2 battalion commanders. Years of work reduced to a red square. Colonel James Harlan cleared his throat. The sound felt louder than artillery in that silence. I could hear the ventilation system humming above us. I did not know what they believed I had done. I only knew my record had been marked. And when the Pentagon marks your file, the room does not argue. It goes quiet. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Captain Lauren Mitchell. I grew up in rural Ohio, outside a town small enough that the high school football field doubled as the 4th of July parade route. My father ran a feed store. My mother taught 3rd grade. We did not talk about politics at the dinner table. We talked about responsibility. If you put your name on something, it meant you stood behind it. I commissioned through Reserve Officers Training Corps and went on active duty the summer after graduation. By the year 2014, I had already completed 1 deployment to eastern Afghanistan. I was assigned as an intelligence officer to an infantry battalion operating in the mountains near the Kunar province. My job there was to interpret patterns, phone intercepts, human source reports, drone imagery. I learned quickly that bad information travels faster than corrections. And once a unit moves on flawed intelligence, you cannot rewind what happens next. Fort McCoy was supposed to be steady ground after that. It was a training installation in Wisconsin, surrounded by woods and open land. Reserve and National Guard units rotated through before deploying overseas. My assignment was inside a joint training cell. We built scenarios. We drafted simulated threat networks. We reviewed intelligence packets that would shape how units responded during exercises. Most days were routine. I would sit in the conference room with a small team, go page by page through scenario binders, verify sourcing, confirm that names used in the training materials were either fictional or properly cleared. It was not glamorous work, but it mattered. Soldiers treat training like rehearsal. If rehearsal is wrong, the real performance suffers. That spring, the schedule included an exercise labeled multi-agency integration. It involved active duty elements, reserve components, and federal observers from outside the Department of Defense. That alone was not unusual. What made it different was the sensitivity of the scenario. It simulated domestic unrest, linked to foreign financial networks. The intelligence packet supporting it was thicker than usual. 3 weeks before the war room meeting, I began my review. At first, nothing stood out. The formatting was clean. Citations were footnoted. Financial charts were attached in appendices. But when I cross-checked several of the names against internal databases, I noticed inconsistencies. One individual listed as a suspected intermediary did not appear in any known reporting streams. Another name had a similar spelling to a legitimate case file but did not match dates of birth or known associates. The financial trails were the part that unsettled me most. The charts showed transfers routed through shell organizations. But when I traced the cited sources, the references led to outdated reporting or reports that did not support the conclusions drawn. It was subtle. Not an obvious fabrication, but enough to raise concern. I brought the packet to my immediate supervisor, Major Thomas Greeley. He had been in the branch longer than I had. Calm, efficient, not prone to overreaction. I explained the discrepancies. The mismatched identifiers, the weak sourcing. He listened without interrupting. Then he leaned back in his chair and said it was above my pay grade. The materials had already been coordinated at higher levels. My role was procedural review, not investigative challenge. Sign off anyway, he said. The exercise timeline could not slip. I remember staring at the signature line on the approval page. My name printed neatly beneath it, Captain Lauren Mitchell. In Afghanistan, I had watched a patrol adjust its route because of a single sentence in one of my reports. That sentence was based on 3 independent sources. I had triple-checked it before it ever reached the commander. Because, if I was wrong, someone else would pay. At Fort McCoy, the consequences felt less immediate. It was training, simulated scenarios, but the mindset built in training carries into reality. I told Major Greeley I was not comfortable approving the packet as written. I requested clarification on the specific data points that did not align. He sighed, not angry, just impatient. He reminded me that the materials had already been vetted by external contributors. He suggested that delaying approval could be interpreted as resistance to the exercise framework. I went back to my office and drafted a memorandum for record. It was professional. Measured. I outlined the discrepancies. I cited the database searches. I requested written confirmation of the source validation. I did not accuse anyone of misconduct. I did not use emotional language. I simply asked for verification. I sent it up through formal channels. It felt small when I hit send. 2 weeks later, in a room full of officers and civilian observers, my file turned red on a projection screen. That was the first time I understood that asking for clarification can be mistaken for defiance. The first warning sign was not the red screen in the war room. It was the hallway. Fort McCoy is not a large post. You learn people's walking pace, who nods, who stops to talk. The week after I sent my memorandum, those small routines shifted. Conversations paused when I approached. A lieutenant who normally asked me questions about analysis techniques suddenly found reasons to check his phone instead. Major Greeley stopped inviting me to the informal planning huddles that happened before formal briefings. I would learn about adjustments to the exercise secondhand, through updated calendar invites instead of face-to-face discussion. When I tried to access a shared drive folder containing scenario revisions, the system stalled. Then it displayed a permissions error. I told myself it was a software glitch. In the Army, you are trained to assume process before conspiracy. Forms get misrouted, emails get buried. I had no proof of anything else. 3 days later, I received a message instructing me to report to the Installation Security Office for what was described as a routine clearance verification. The phrase routine clearance verification sounds harmless. It happens periodically. Background checks are updated. Foreign contacts are reviewed. Financial disclosures are confirmed. I walked into the small office at 0900 hours. A civilian investigator introduced himself as Mr. Harold Bennett, mid-50s, neatly pressed shirt. Polite but distant, he began with standard questions. Confirm your current address. Confirm your last deployment location. Confirm any foreign travel since redeployment. Then he shifted. He asked about Eastern Afghanistan, about the Kunar province, about an interpreter assigned to our battalion during the year 2012. His name was Daniel Rahimi. Daniel was 23 years old when he worked with us. He spoke English with a careful precision, like he weighed every word before releasing it. During one patrol through a narrow valley road, he noticed a disturbed patch of dirt near a culvert. He pointed it out to our platoon leader. Engineers later uncovered an improvised explosive device wired beneath it. No one was injured that day because he paid attention. After we redeployed, I wrote a letter supporting his special immigrant visa application. I described his service, his reliability, the risk he had taken simply by wearing our patch. Mr. Bennett asked whether I had maintained contact with Daniel after returning to the United States. I told him no. I had submitted the letter, and that was the extent of my involvement. He asked whether Daniel had ever requested additional assistance from me, financial or otherwise. No. Whether I had ever communicated with him through personal email accounts? No. The questions were measured, calm, but they circled the same point from different angles. Foreign contact, influence, undisclosed relationships. I answered truthfully. I had nothing to hide. Still, the interview lasted longer than routine reviews usually do. Nearly 90 minutes. When I left the office, I felt as though I had been weighed and found suspect, though no accusation had been spoken. That afternoon, I returned to the intelligence section building and walked to the classified vault to retrieve updated training materials. I swiped my access badge. The reader blinked yellow, then red. Access denied. I tried again. Same result. A staff sergeant inside the vault looked up through the glass panel. He hesitated before opening the door manually. He said my name had been removed from the authorized entry list pending review. Pending review. No one had notified me. I stepped back into the hallway and stood there for several seconds, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. My clearance level had not changed on paper. No formal suspension notice had been delivered. But the practical effect was already in place. Isolation without explanation. By close of business that day, my official email access to certain classified networks had been restricted, not fully revoked, just limited, enough to make it clear that something was moving behind the scenes. I went home that evening and replayed every decision I had made over the previous month, the memorandum, the request for source validation, the conversation with Major Greeley. Had I crossed a procedural line? Had I misinterpreted my authority? I kept coming back to the same conclusion. I had asked for clarification. Nothing more. The next morning, I passed two officers in the hallway who stopped speaking as I approached. One of them offered a tight nod. The other avoided my eyes completely. That was when I understood. This was not administrative delay. It was containment. Someone, somewhere above my pay grade, had decided that my request for verification signaled risk. And rather than address the content of my concerns, they were examining me. The red screen in the war room would come later. The first real warning was that quiet hallway where routine courtesy dissolved into distance, and my access badge began to fail before any official word ever reached me. That was when I knew this was deliberate. The exercise continued without me. I watched it unfold from a desk that no longer had access to the systems I used every day. My temporary reassignment placed me in a corner office handling unclassified administrative reviews. No briefings. No scenario approvals, just paper routing and compliance checklists. Through overheard conversations and sanitized updates, I pieced together what I could. The scenario I had refused to sign off on centered around simulated domestic unrest in a Midwestern city. The narrative linked several local community organizers to foreign funding streams that allegedly trace back to extremist networks overseas. The intelligence packet presented charts, timelines, and communication intercept summaries. On the surface, it looked sophisticated, but I knew the weak seams, the names that did not align, the financial transfers that lacked original sourcing. If those materials were used in training, soldiers would rehearse responses to a threat picture built on unstable ground. Training shapes perception. Perception shapes action. In Afghanistan, I had seen how a single misidentified village elder labeled as a facilitator could fracture months of relationship building. We corrected the error eventually, but the damage lingered. People remember when they are wrongly accused. That was what stayed with me as the exercise moved forward without my approval. A week after my vault access was revoked, I received a message to report to Colonel James Harlan's office at 1300 hours. His office was orderly. Flags placed precisely. Framed commendations aligned evenly on the wall. He gestured for me to sit. He did not raise his voice. He did not reference the red screen directly. Instead, he asked measured questions. Had I ever disclosed classified information outside authorized channels? No. Had I maintained undisclosed foreign contacts? No. Did I harbor personal objections to certain operational frameworks used in domestic threat simulations? I paused at that one. I told him the truth. I did not object to mission sets. I objected to inaccuracies. Intelligence must be defensible. If a name appears in a packet, it must be verifiable. If a financial chart is displayed, it must trace back to confirmed sources. I explained that my concern was not ideological, it was procedural. Accuracy protects the force. Accuracy protects civilians. Colonel Harlan listened without interruption. His expression did not change. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk. He said the Department of Defense operates on trust. When an officer challenges materials that have already been coordinated at higher levels, it can be interpreted as questioning that trust. I responded carefully. Trust is strengthened by verification, not weakened by it. The room went quiet after that. He did not agree with me, but he did not accuse me either. He concluded the meeting by stating that the review process would continue and that I should remain focused on assigned duties. When I left his office, nothing had shifted. The red flag remained in place. Inside the unit, the atmosphere changed further. Rumors moved faster than official statements. I heard secondhand that some believed I had communicated concerns outside the chain of command. Others speculated that my previous deployment contacts had triggered scrutiny. One afternoon, a junior analyst who had once asked for my mentorship avoided sitting near me in the cafeteria. Another officer offered a brief whisper of support in a parking lot but asked me not to mention the conversation to anyone. The isolation settled slowly, like cold air seeping under a door. No one confronted me openly. There was no dramatic accusation. Instead, there was distance. Professional courtesy thinned. Invitations to collaborative reviews stopped arriving. My name appeared less frequently on distribution lists. The hardest part was not anger. I could have handled anger. Anger is direct. It acknowledges conflict. This was different. It was suspicion without words. I replayed my decision again and again. Should I have signed the packet and addressed concerns later? Should I have raised them verbally instead of in writing? But each time I imagined putting my signature on those materials, I felt the same weight in my chest. If I approved something I knew was flawed, the responsibility would be mine. Not abstract. Not shared. Mine. Weeks earlier, I had stood in a valley in Afghanistan watching a platoon move forward based on my reporting. I remembered the look in a young specialist's eyes as he scanned a ridgeline, trusting that what we told him was accurate. That memory steadied me. Still, as the exercise progressed without my involvement and my file remained marked, I understood something clearly. In the Army, reputation can shift quietly, not with explosions, with memos, with access revocations, with conversations held in rooms you are no longer invited into. And the silence that followed me through those hallways was heavier than any direct accusation could have been. I was given a choice without anyone using the word choice. It came in the form of a thin folder placed on my temporary desk late on a Thursday afternoon. No meeting, no formal counseling session, just a routing slip and a document clipped neatly inside. The subject line read, "Acknowledgement of Procedural Deviation." I closed my office door before opening it. The statement was written in careful, neutral language. It explained that during the review of the multi-agency integration exercise materials, I had failed to exercise appropriate discretion by elevating concerns beyond my immediate supervisory chain. It stated that my actions had contributed to unnecessary delay in operational readiness. It concluded with a paragraph noting that by signing, I acknowledged the error and agreed to corrective mentorship. It did not accuse me of misconduct. It did not mention foreign contacts. It did not reference the red flag directly, but it implied something else. Personal bias. That phrase appeared in the middle of the second paragraph. It suggested that my hesitation to approve the packet may have stemmed from subjective concerns rather than objective analysis. I read the document once, then again, then a third time, slower. If I signed it, the matter would likely close. That much was implied when Major Greeley stopped by later that afternoon. He did not sit down. He stood near the door and spoke in a low, even tone. He said the command was willing to consider this a learning moment. He said my career was still salvageable. He said clearance reinstatement would be much easier if I demonstrated alignment with the review process. He did not threaten me. He did not need to. In the Army, a minor reprimand on record can fade with time. A sustained clearance investigation can end a career quietly and permanently. After he left, I sat alone with the document. I thought about the soldiers rotating through Fort McCoy that spring, young reserve infantrymen from small towns in Iowa, National Guard mechanics from Tennessee, 19 years old, 20 years old, some older balancing civilian jobs and military service. They would receive the scenario packet as fact. They would rehearse decision-making based on the names and financial networks outlined inside. They would internalize the threat picture we constructed. Training becomes memory. Memory becomes instinct. If the packet was flawed, that instinct would be flawed. I turned to my computer and reopened the original files I had saved before my access restrictions tightened. I reviewed the discrepancies again, the mismatched identifiers, the outdated source citations, the financial transfers that lacked corroboration. Nothing had changed. The flaws were still there. The difference now was the cost of insisting on them. I picked up a pen and hovered it over the signature line. For a moment, I imagined signing, closing the folder, watching the red flag disappear, returning to the vault. Briefing like nothing had happened. The path would be smoother. But every time I imagined signing, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pride, not defiance, responsibility. In Afghanistan, we once delayed a patrol for 6 hours because a single source report felt thin. Some officers grumbled. It turned out the source had been exaggerating. No device was found along the route. The delay frustrated everyone, but no one was harmed. Accuracy sometimes looks like inconvenience. I set the pen down. Instead of signing, I opened a new document and began drafting an addendum. I wrote plainly. I cited specific examples. I attached screenshots of database searches. I referenced the financial charts and pointed out the absence of primary sourcing. I requested independent validation from the originating agency. I avoided emotional language. I did not accuse anyone of fabrication. I simply documented the gaps. The memo was longer than my first one. When I finished, I read it aloud quietly to myself to ensure the tone remained professional. No sarcasm. No implied accusation, just facts. Before sending it, I paused. This was the point of no return. Once that addendum entered the system, it would be clear that I was not accepting the procedural deviation label. The investigation would not close quietly. The red flag might intensify. I thought about my father's voice from years earlier, standing in the feed store after a supplier delivered damaged grain. If your name is on it, you stand behind it. My name was on the review line. I attached the supporting documents and routed the addendum through official channels. The confirmation notification appeared in my inbox seconds later. Sent. The room felt smaller after that. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the blank wall in front of me. There was no dramatic music. No sense of triumph. Only a steady awareness that I had stepped fully into whatever consequences followed. Once that memo left my hands, I knew there was no going back. The crisis did not explode. It tightened. There was no dramatic confrontation. No raised voices in hallways. Just a formal notification delivered to my government email at 0830 on a Monday morning. Subject line: temporary suspension of clearance pending review. The language was sterile. Effective immediately. My access to classified systems was revoked. I was reassigned to administrative duties outside the intelligence section until the review concluded. Estimated timeline undetermined. Undetermined is a heavy word when your entire career depends on clearance. I packed the few personal items from my vault desk into a cardboard box, a framed photo of my parents, a deployment patch from Afghanistan, a notebook filled with analysis notes. The staff sergeant who normally joked with me about coffee strength avoided eye contact as I carried the box past him. My new desk was in a different building. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, no secure phones. My tasking involved updating training schedules and verifying equipment inventory lists. Work that needed to be done, but far from my professional specialty. The exercise continued without my input. From my new seat, I could see junior officers from the intelligence section walking across the parking lot each morning. Some glanced in my direction and then looked away. Others offered a quiet nod, the kind that said, "I see what is happening, but I cannot stand next to you." One afternoon, a first lieutenant named Sarah Connors stopped by my desk. She closed the door behind her and kept her voice low. She said she had read portions of my addendum before my access was cut. She believed the discrepancies were real. She thanked me for documenting them. Then she added that she could not be seen supporting me publicly. Her own evaluation was due soon. She had student loans. She had plans for graduate school. I told her I understood, and I did. Integrity is easier to admire from a distance than to share up close. The days settled into a routine of waiting. Waiting for updates. Waiting for interviews. Waiting for someone to say something definitive. At 2:17 in the morning one night, I woke up without knowing why. The room was dark. The digital clock cast a faint blue glow across the ceiling. Daniel Rahimi's face came to mind. I had not thought about him in months. But in that moment, I remembered the way he stood slightly behind our patrol leader, always scanning rooftops and alleyways. He trusted us to protect him as much as we trusted him to interpret. If someone had labeled him incorrectly in a report, if his name had been placed on a list without evidence, it could have followed him for the rest of his life. In his country, a false association could be fatal. That was what this felt like, a label. Not a loud accusation, not a court-martial. Just a file marked in red, implying risk. The pressure point was not humiliation. Most people did not know the details of my situation. It was uncertainty. Every morning I checked my email expecting either vindication or termination of clearance. Neither came. If the review concluded that I posed a risk, my career would end quietly. No ceremony. No explanation to peers. Just reassignment, separation paperwork, and a notation in a file somewhere in Washington. I began to understand how fragile professional identity can be. One week you are briefing senior officers. The next, you are updating supply spreadsheets while your name circulates in rooms you are no longer allowed to enter. Rumors drifted back to me in fragments. Some said I had challenged federal partners directly. Others suggested my foreign contact history was under scrutiny. No one repeated anything concrete. The silence was strategic. Silence keeps a person off balance. It leaves room for imagination to fill in worst-case scenarios. I kept replaying the war room in my head, the red screen, Colonel Harlan's measured tone, the way no one had looked at me immediately. I wondered whether anyone remembered why I hesitated over that signature line. Would they recall the specific names I flagged? The financial inconsistencies? Or would the narrative simplify into something easier? Captain Mitchell became difficult. Captain Mitchell delayed readiness. Captain Mitchell triggered review. Late one afternoon, I saw a revised version of the exercise binder being carried across the parking lot by a junior analyst. For a moment, I wondered if the packet had been adjusted, if someone had quietly corrected the discrepancies. But I had no access to confirm it. The tightening continued. Each passing day without resolution felt like another turn of a screw. Not painful enough to scream, just constant enough to wear down resolve. I started writing notes to myself at the end of each day. Short entries, what I knew, what I did not know, why I made the choices I made. I did it because I was afraid that, over time, Even I might begin to doubt my own reasoning. That was the real danger. Not the red flag, not the reassignment, but the slow erosion of confidence that happens when you are isolated long enough. And in that isolation, I understood something clearly. If the review ended my career, it would not be because I leaked information or broke faith with the Army. It would be because I insisted that intelligence be accurate. The difference might never be recorded in my file, but it mattered to me. The turning point came from somewhere I did not expect. I had prepared myself for the possibility that no one would speak up, that the review would close quietly with my name attached to a cautionary note about procedural alignment. I had accepted that silence might win. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, I was called back to the security office. The same civilian investigator, Mr. Gainey, Bennett, sat across from me. His posture was different this time, less rigid. He informed me that an additional individual had requested to provide voluntary information regarding the exercise materials in question. Her name was Rebecca Lawson. Rebecca was a civilian analyst contracted to assist with scenario development. Mid-30s, analytical, reserved. We had spoken only briefly during initial coordination meetings. I had not known her well enough to expect anything from her. According to Mr. Bennett, Rebecca had independently reviewed portions of the intelligence packet after hearing that concerns had been raised. She had access to some of the originating data streams through her agency channels. She found the same discrepancies I had documented. Fabricated financial links that could not be traced to primary reporting. Source citations that referenced outdated assessments. One individual's name that had been lifted from an unrelated case file and inserted into the scenario without proper context. Rebecca had documented her findings and requested to brief the investigative team directly. Mr. Bennett did not smile. He did not apologize. He simply stated that her input necessitated expansion of the review. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift. It was not relief. Not yet, but movement. Over the next several days, additional interviews were conducted within the training cell. Access logs were reviewed. Coordination emails were examined. The origin of specific data points in the packet became a focal point rather than my response to them. I remained reassigned. My clearance remained suspended. But the narrative was no longer centered solely on my decision to withhold approval. 2 weeks later, an internal notice circulated within the command group. The multi-agency integration exercise scenario was suspended pending material correction and validation. Revised timelines would be issued after review. There was no public explanation, no meeting where someone acknowledged the specific flaws. But the exercise stopped. The same afternoon, I received an updated status on my clearance review. The red flag designation was downgraded to administrative review pending corrective action within the training cell. My access reinstatement would be processed upon completion of updated validation protocols. The language was careful. It did not say I had been right. It did not say the packet had been flawed. It framed the situation as procedural recalibration. Still, the effect was clear. The focus had shifted from my character to the content. I was called back to the war room the following week, not to brief, not to defend, just to attend a coordination meeting regarding revised sourcing standards. When I entered the room, it felt different from the day the screen turned red. No projection of my name, no highlighted box, just binders spread across the table and a list of corrective steps on the agenda. Colonel Harlan sat at the head of the table. He acknowledged my presence with a brief nod. Nothing more. Rebecca Lawson was there as well. She avoided dramatic gestures, no speeches. She presented her findings in a measured tone, walking through the sourcing gaps and outlining recommendations for cross-verification procedures moving forward. The room listened. There was no apology directed at me, no formal statement of vindication. But there was something else. Silence. Not the suspicious silence that follows a red flag. A different kind. The kind that settles when people recognize that something foundational was not as solid as they assumed, After the meeting, as officers filed out, a few made brief eye contact with me. Not avoidance this time, something closer to acknowledgement. Major Greeley did not approach me. He remained seated, reviewing his notes long after most had left. Later that week, my clearance was fully reinstated, access restored. Email privileges returned. My desk in the vault reassigned to me without ceremony. No one issued a formal correction to the rumors that had circulated. No bulletin declared that Captain Mitchell had acted appropriately. But within the intelligence section, procedures changed. Secondary source validation became mandatory before scenario approval. Financial charts required documented primary reporting. Cross-agency inputs were flagged for independent confirmation. The packet had been wrong. That fact did not arrive with applause. It arrived quietly, through procedural adjustments and revised checklists. But in the war room, when those revisions were briefed, there was a stillness that felt different from the day my name turned red. It was the stillness of recognition. And for the first time since the investigation began, I understood that standing alone in that moment had not been pointless. It had forced the room to look more closely, not at me, at the work itself. My clearance was reinstated after 31 days. The notification arrived without ceremony, just another email in my inbox confirming full access restoration effective immediately. No explanation beyond administrative review complete. No reference to the red designation that had followed my name for a month. 31 days is not a long time in a military career. But it is long enough to understand how quickly everything can shift. I walked back into the vault that afternoon and swiped my badge. The reader flashed green. The door unlocked with its familiar mechanical click. Inside, the air smelled the same. The desks were arranged exactly as I had left them. Yet the room felt different. People looked up when I entered. Some offered polite smiles. Others returned quickly to their screens. A few nodded in a way that carried more weight than before. Major Greeley was reassigned 2 weeks later. The official announcement cited career progression and leadership opportunity at another installation. There was no mention of the exercise review. No connection drawn publicly between his departure and the packet. That is how most corrections happen in uniform. Quietly, Colonel Harlan called me into his office once more before the exercise resumed. He spoke in measured tones, the same way he had during our earlier meeting. He said I had demonstrated resilience under pressure. He used the word integrity. He said that maintaining professional standards in complex environments is not always easy. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge that my file had been marked prematurely. He did not say the system had overreached. Instead, he framed the experience as part of leadership development. I listened. I nodded. I thanked him for his time. In the Army, acknowledgement often comes wrapped in institutional language. The exercise resumed months later with revised materials. The financial charts were rebuilt from primary sources. Names were cross-verified across multiple databases. External agency contributions required documented validation before inclusion. The scenario itself did not change dramatically. What changed was the rigor behind it. I returned to my role reviewing packets. I approached each one with the same methodical care as before. But now, when I flagged a discrepancy, no one told me it was above my pay grade. The culture shifted subtly. Not everyone treated me the same after that. Some officers kept their distance as if I represented unnecessary risk. They were polite, but cautious. They measured their words carefully in my presence, perhaps unsure whether challenging process could spread. Others treated me with a different kind of respect. Quiet. Unspoken. A staff sergeant once told me, months later, that he had followed the situation closely. He said it reminded him that junior leaders can question respectfully without undermining the mission. I carried both reactions with me. What stayed with me most was not a sense of victory. It was awareness. Awareness of how quickly a file can turn red. One moment, your name is associated with competence and trust. The next, it is marked as potential risk based on perception rather than proof. The machinery of review moves fast. It does not pause to consider how the individual experiences it. Reputation in uniform feels solid. It is built on evaluations, deployment records, and endorsements. But I learned that it is also fragile. Process can override people before context has a chance to surface. There were nights after my clearance was restored when I still woke up at odd hours, heart racing slightly, half expecting another notification. The body remembers stress even after the paperwork resolves. I also thought often about Rebecca Lawson. She never sought recognition. She did not ask for thanks. She simply saw the same gaps and chose to document them. Integrity does not always wear a uniform. Over time, the story of the red screen faded from open conversation. New exercises replaced old ones. New officers rotated in. For many, it became a footnote. But for me, it remained a marker. I learned that integrity in uniform does not always look dramatic. It does not always involve battlefield decisions or visible acts of courage. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, like a memo sent through formal channels, like refusing to sign a document that would make life easier. Sometimes it looks like standing alone in a war room while your name glows on a screen and choosing not to lower your eyes. That month changed how I viewed leadership, not as authority, but as responsibility to truth, even when truth complicates timelines and irritates superiors. The Army continued moving forward, as it always does. So did I. But I never forgot how thin the line can be between trust and suspicion, and how important it is to stand steady when that line shifts beneath you. I stayed in the Army for several more years after that. I deployed once more overseas. I stood in briefing rooms in places most Americans will never see. I trained younger intelligence officers who reminded me of myself at 24 years old, eager to prove they belonged. And every time I reviewed a report, every time I hovered over a signature block before approving it, I remembered that red screen in the war room at Fort McCoy, not because it nearly ended my career, but because it showed me how much weight a single label can carry. Accuracy is not just a technical requirement. It is protection. It protects the 19-year-old private stepping onto a convoy route. It protects the civilian whose name might appear in a database. It protects the credibility of the uniform we wear. The Pentagon never called to explain why my file turned red. No one sat me down and said the system moved too fast. The designation simply vanished from my record, replaced by silence. But I carry that silence with me. When institutions move quickly, someone has to slow the process long enough to ask one simple question. Is this true? That morning, when my name glowed on the screen, I believed everything I had worked for was about to disappear. Instead, I learned what responsibility really weighs. It is not medals. It is not rank. It is not recognition. It is the quiet decision to stand by what you know is right, even when your own name turns red. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.